morning from Hawaii. It's like a beautiful morning here. It's been very chilly lately, and by chilly I mean it's like in the 60s at night. So that's the way it goes here. My name is Brandon Fairchild. I'm the National Membership Chair. I'm originally from Ohio, actually. So I'm from the greater Cincinnati area. I'm from Lebanon, Ohio, so right next to Kings Island, if you've been to Kings Island. And then I went to college in Kentucky at Center College, which is just outside of Lexington, small liberal arts school, Theta Theta chapter, very proud. And I'm really excited to come and talk to you guys today. I've been really close friends with Brittany for a long time. She's both somebody who looked up to me when I was a section chair around there, and I've come to really look up to Brittany. So it's a real honor to be able to sit with you guys today and chat. So we're talking about retention. And I just want to like foreclose this whole conversation by saying that I'm going to provide some practical advice sort of toward the tail end of the presentation, but this is really about, again, if you were in that webinar that workshop that I was in Indianapolis with the NCAA headquarters, this is really about trying to radically like rethink how you approach topics like retention and brotherhood. So like I said, there will be pragmatic stuff, but I always, because I'm a liberal arts kid and a PhD candidate, I'm always really committed to how can we think about things differently? And if we think about things differently, then maybe there's a way for us to do it differently eventually. I don't think you can get to doing things differently if you don't think about them differently. So again, like I said earlier, I'm going to ask you guys to engage throughout the presentation. So I'm excited to hear about how things are going for you. Let me admit somebody into the room first. Okay, so I like to always start with an agenda. So first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to check in on you all, have you all share how things are going with you. Then I'm going to talk about retention. We're going to talk about retention models. I think the one that I'm going to lay out to you, or the two I'm going to lay out to you, are really easy. So hopefully you think the same thing. Then I want to do some crowdsourcing between all of us in the new style of retention model that I'm talking about, like talk about ideas that we may have for how we can support retention in a variety of different ways. Then I'm going to, again, get into that pragmatic advice that I mentioned earlier. We're going to do some retention tips. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some resources that the National Office provided, and also some new and exciting programming that's going to be coming out both in the fall and sort of throughout the course of the next academic year that I'm really pumped about. And then at the very end, I want to talk about re-engagement of inactive brothers. That's not in the slides, but I think that that's going to be really pivotal for how we think about retention going into the fall, as we hopefully, maybe, return back to campus. I don't know. Some of you may already be on campus, but as we move more toward normalcy from the new normal that we've all established with each other. So again, I just wanted to check in on you. So I'll have a couple people share. So my questions are, how engaged with the fraternity do you feel right now? Obviously, all of you are at a conference, a virtual conference, so you may be more engaged than some of your other brothers, but how engaged are you feeling subjectively? And then my more important question is, how do you know that? How are you aware of that engagement? So would anybody like to share how they're feeling about the fraternity at the moment?
Yeah, I do feel like I feel pretty engaged in my chapter, like you said. Being at a conference definitely feels like a part of that, but I also feel engaged just because I've been getting to know a lot more people in my chapter and feeling like I've made more connections, and I feel like that's a sign that I'm getting more engaged and like becoming a stronger part of it.
That's great. Anybody else? John?
I know I've felt more engaged, especially like this past year, possibly because like there's been a bit less engagement from like a lot of other people over the past year. So like in a way, I've been more engaged because like I've wanted to help make sure that we're doing what we usually do in terms of programming and like providing the same opportunities, which has involved me getting more engaged to make sure that we have like events on the calendar that people are interested in.
Sure. Yeah, so not making up for people's lack of engagement necessarily, but acknowledging like the need for that to be active and participatory, maybe in a way that wasn't as completely necessary when we were in a different sort of space. I think about the way in which like just like our bodies showing up in space was a way that we were engaging. Like just the act of like being in a room with other people was just this passive method of engagement that we don't have access to anymore. So it's required like a whole different way of staying engaged and staying involved, that I think does require a lot more commitment. Yeah, for sure. And I also like, we're all troubleshooting all the time, right? We're all thinking about different ways that we can engage. So because of that, I think it's such a more active experience of like, okay, how do we make sure that I'm involved? How can I make sure that I see people in a way that, yeah, a lot of things that were latent and that were passive have suddenly become very active and have become very obvious to all of us. Thank you both for sharing. I think that this to me is sort of the key, that this question, you know, I'm asking it within the context of this sort of weird space we've all been in for the last, you know, year or so. But I think this is the base level conversation and question that we all need to be asking when we're talking about retention. How engaged do we feel, and how engaged do our brothers seem, or do they express that they are in the organization? And how do they know that? It's not just enough to be like, oh, like, I think that maybe we've all done that, where we've had a conversation with somebody and they've been like, oh, I'm not feeling as plugged in as I want to. But nobody ever goes on to ask the second question about like, well, how do you know that? Like, what is the experience of that like? Like, is it that you're not going to events anymore? Is it that you don't want to go to things anymore? I think the nuance of that conversation really gets at how do we re-engage somebody that may be sort of pulling back from us, and we have to know that in order to do something about it. So you know, we're all dealing with all of these stressors right now. We're always dealing with a lot of these stressors, except for hopefully like the fear of COVID-19, and there's a lot of things on this list that I wish we weren't dealing with, you know, social isolation, family, friends, keeping up with school, COVID, political, social turmoil that we've been engaged in. For me, a lot less since January, but for a lot of people, you know, you may be feeling more politically stressed since January. I don't know. Racial injustice obviously is a major topic. We're dealing with the George Floyd trial right now. Personal futures, money, finances, loss. And I don't list these things off for everybody to get stressed out by them, because I'm telling you that you should be stressed. But I think acknowledging that right now, it's not a normal time, and some of us may feel more engaged than we've ever felt with the fraternity. And there's a lot of people who probably have pulled back, but I don't think that that is a demonstration of anything about the organization right now. I think it's just an acknowledgement that we're all dealing with stuff, and that's okay. And we need to have grace for each other at the moment as we move forward. So I'm going to list some of that stuff off. So let's talk about an easy retention model. I think it is easy. I hope you think so too as we go through it. So again, because I'm an academic, I always want to make sure that we're on the same page with what we're talking about. So I just wanted to establish, when I'm talking about retention, that I mean the ability of an organization, in this case your chapter, to keep members active and engaged. It's not sufficient to just have people be active, because you can, again, have bodies that are there that aren't necessarily doing anything. So you want them to be engaged in whatever activity you're doing. I think if you lose engagement, then you will quickly lose somebody as like an active participant and stuff. One follows the other. So another secondary question that I want a couple people to answer, if you don't mind, is why have you in particular remained active and engaged? We often ask the question about like, why did you pledge? But I don't think that's as interesting of a question as like, why have you stuck around, particularly during this time? when it would be very easy to just, shut your computer down and not have to see anybody. So easy. Anybody?
I think it's the fact that it gives you a sense of normalcy.
Normalcy.
I mean, being able to at least see people and have discussions, even virtually. If you can't meet in person, at least you have a chance to meet virtually. And it gives that kind of feeling of normal, even when everything else is out of control.
Yeah. It's so interesting the ways in which something that I think for all of us would have been so completely abnormal, like all of our social interactions being over a computer, now feels like maybe the most normal part of our lives and best resembles what we had before. Yeah, cool. Thank you. What about?
I'll say, I think this year I'm my chapter surgeon at arms, and I automatically felt, having an elected position, being on executive board, I would just naturally be more engaged. But in the fall, I quickly realized that doing more of the behind the scenes stuff and not the active membership, going to events, made me experience burnout easily or more quickly. And the reason why I remained active and engaged was going to events and talking to pledges and talking to new members. There's I think Sean mentioned the feeling of normalcy, but it was a baby APO spark. It was just wow, I've missed this. I've missed, just talking to bros. These are people that I love. These are all amazing people. And just, I don't know, just this sense of community and camaraderie, just kind of getting together. If it was a service event, all having a conversation, or even the fellowship events, whatever it was was just nice to connect with the bros. I basically just engaged because remained engaged because being engaged was fun and made me appreciate the whole APO experience much more.
Yeah, well, I think that really speaks to me. I think a lot of it is, we're all looking for something to do just in general, but I think that law, we're social animals, and I think that lost a sense of community that we've all experienced by virtue of, our own varying degrees of isolation, I think definitely contributes to why even a virtual environment feels reassuring in a lot of different ways. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, again, I think that this is another interesting question to start asking your brothers too in your chapters, is what is keeping them around and why do they care? And the reason that that's an important question to ask is because if suddenly your chapter stops providing the things that is keeping them active, engaged, then they will disengage. So it's a great question, and I think especially during pledging and recruitment, it's people love to ask that question. Why did you pledge? Why did you join? And there's always an entertaining degree of options. A lot of people say oh, I joined for the service, or oh, I joined for friendship. If you were in that session with me in Indianapolis, you know that I joined because I thought a boy was cute exclusively. And the membership chair before me joined because they had free donuts and he loves free food. So we all joined for various reasons, but that doesn't really demonstrate much about the power of the organization to keep somebody engaged and also add something to their lives. So I encourage you all to ask this sort of a question as well, to get deeper into retention, because like I said, if you know why people are staying, then you should continue to do those things. And if you make a change to one of those things, it's an acknowledgement that potentially something can change and you need to, with somebody's membership engagement, and you should just be aware of that whenever you're engaging in those sorts of changes. So you may have seen this before. It's in a lot of our national documents about membership. It's how you calculate a retention rate. Generally, this is where the conversation nationally with retention sort of stops and starts, or starts and stops. So it'll be it's exactly what it says here. You'll have pledge or new member retention, which is how many people pledged, or how many people initiated over how many people pledged, multiply that by 100, and then you have a retention rate. Same thing with your chapter at large retention. So it's number of returning active members over the number of people you reported last year, plus the people you initiated, minus the people who graduated or left the institution. I I personally don't think that people who, you know, have to leave the institution for financial reasons need to be calculated necessarily in a retention rate, because that doesn't have anything to do with what your chapter is doing. That's an external factor that we don't need to be considering when we're thinking about how well are we retaining our members. Then you multiply that by 100 and then you have a retention rate. That's great, but like I'm a sociologist. I am not a quantitative sociologist. I'm a qualitative sociologist. I want to know why. I want to know how. I don't just want to know how much or what. So this tells you, you know, a number, and that's basically it. And I don't necessarily think it's much helpful beyond that, aside from like flagging your region chairs and section chairs as to when there's a problem. that's the big use. So let's talk about a better retention model, or a more comprehensive qualitative retention model. So you all may have like seen something similar to this. We talk about the membership life cycle or the membership timeline a lot in the fraternity. You know, that sort of starts with you learn about Alpha Phi Omega, you are recruited. That, I think generally we don't think about that as part of our membership. That's sort of pre-membership. And then there's not tentative, but pledging is like, you know, preliminary membership, I guess. Then you become an active member, you go through it, maybe you become an officer, you become a big, maybe you go inactive at some point, you come back, maybe you go associate, et cetera, and then you graduate. I think generally the three portions of this timeline that I've listed here are not necessarily thought of as part of retention more broadly. It's like active membership is retention. We think a little bit about pledging as retention, and then but retention really only happens in pledging once people initiate, based on that equation that I just showed you guys. I don't think that that's very helpful. So I want to argue that actually the way that I would encourage you to initially reconceive of retention in your chapters is to think about recruitment, pledging, and active membership as retention. All of those things are retention, and they start the second that somebody learns about Alpha Phi Omega. Bear with me as I sort of like make the argument. So recruitment is when you make the promise of the value of membership in your chapter. Essentially, this is laying the groundwork for retention. So you're saying to people who may be interested, here is what you can expect. This is what your experience will like generally base minimum be like. And that should be honest. I think that there are ways in which recruitment tends to obfuscate or hide or you know, sort of like not disguise completely. I don't think anybody's lying. But you know, when we have themes, when we have you know, sort of like these pre-packaged elevator speech sort of ideologies about what recruitment is, I think that we get away from understanding that we're actually laying the groundwork for somebody, once they get to active membership, to determine, oh, I got what they said I was going to get. And because I got what they said I was going to get, I'm going to be retained by virtue of that, because they made the promise and I got it. You know, nobody wants to like go out to like everybody hates this, right? You go to one of your friends is like, oh my God, this restaurant is great and they have great food, and then you get there and then it is not that great, and you're like, I would rather get out of here because this is not the experience I was expecting, but then you're just stuck. And then you never wind up going back, right? Like you're like, I'm never going to do that again. So like I said, recruitment is making that promise. Pledging, within the context of that conversation, is providing the skills and knowledge that members need to realize that value in their own experience. I think that oftentimes we conceive of pledging as sort of somebody, and I find this a very toxic mindset, like somebody proving that they deserve membership in Alpha Phi Omega. they take these tests and they, do these requirements and they do all of this stuff, and you're proving your worth and the value that you have to the organization. And I think that's not great. I almost cursed, but I forgot that this is recording. Pledging is all about the chapter providing the skills and knowledge to realize the value of membership, because you can as a group provide opportunities to do stuff. You have service options and those sorts of things, but like, people need skills and they need knowledge by which to engage. If you don't know the way in which the chapter functions, if you don't understand how meetings work, if you don't understand how elections work, if you don't understand what your requirements are going to be, if you don't know how to run a service project, if you're not given access to all of that information, then the value of the organization isn't going to be totally accessible to you. So again, this is laying the groundwork for retention, because you're saying, here's how you can be retained. This is how you get to contribute to your own retention. And I would encourage all of you, we're not going to spend too much time on pledging at all, but I would encourage all of you to reconceive of pledging as that. How is the chapter providing those skills and knowledge to the members? And are we doing a sufficient job for them to be able to realize that value? And if we as a chapter are not doing that, then how can we expect things out of them? Because we're not expecting enough out of ourselves. And active membership, like I've said throughout this, is that you realize the value of membership. What you promised in recruitment and the skills and knowledge that you provided to people throughout pledging should be what people realize in their active membership. And if it doesn't, then people will leave because they've been duped or they haven't been educated well enough. So I think that sort of in the later years of active membership, it's important that we exceed that value, because people will get bored. We've all had that, seniors who melt off, and early alum or whatever people do. So I think it's important that we think about how do we exceed that promise that we made. But this is sort of the base level that I think that we think about. So that's one retention model that I wanted to toss out there. There's a secondary one that I think is really important in terms of thinking about how are we retaining people once they get into active membership. And I think of retention sort of as like a three-sided triangle of stuff. The first one I think is, so basically what I'm going to argue is retention is possible at the intersection of all three of these sides. And if your chapter isn't sort of like fulfilling one of these triangle sides, then there's the possibility that people won't be retained as a result in your chapter. And if you've been through, I used to do a workshop called Developing a Membership Program, where I basically argued everything is being done by the members, so everything is membership. Literally everything is membership. Membership is not just recruitment, pledging, or just thinking about retention. It's the entirety of a person's experience. So all aspects are continuing to retain people. So if you're in a chapter where you're like, oh, that's the vice president of membership's job to keep people around, that's not their job. That is everybody's job. It's everybody's job, because everybody's being retained for very different reasons. Like, I cared about service to a certain extent, but I was really there for the community. So like, if the fellowship program wasn't strong, I didn't stay, but other people couldn't have given a crud about that necessarily. They were there for the service program. So that was the service chair's job to make sure that they were being retained, essentially. I think it's the membership chair's job to raise that to consciousness, but everybody's job is retention. So the three things on the retention triangle. Number one is something that I do not think people think of as part of retention, but it is absolutely essential, and it is the base of why people stick around, is operational stability of your chapter. If it's a mess, we've all been in this situation, I think, with some organization, some situation where you walk in and they're like, you're like, oh, I believe in the values of this thing. I think it would be really exciting. Leadership, friendship, and service, great. And you walk in and it is a cluster of nonsense that you do not want to deal with. Their meetings are a disaster. Nobody understands how to collect dues. the elections don't make sense. Nobody understands the requirements. If you like, your chapter management system doesn't make any sense. Like, if all of that stuff is, you know, sort of like hell in a handbasket, people will leave, because no matter what, if the values of the organization are great, that doesn't really matter if you feel like things are a mess. So I would encourage all of you to like consider, you know, what are the important parts of operational stability, and we're going to crowdsource this in just a second, talking about how do we sort of attain that. But again, this is the base of retention that I think oftentimes gets lost in a conversation about it. The second is engaging programming, right? So if there's not something for people to do, if there's not a way for them to engage and be active in the organization in a way that they are fulfilled by, then they will leave. And this really gets to the point where retention is about the leadership program, it's about the fellowship program, it's about the service program, but it's about other things too. It could be, what are some other programming options that we have? It could be fundraising. I don't know who the heck sticks around in APO because of fundraising, but you never know. We have everybody and anybody comes around. So keep people engaged in whatever you're doing. And then the third part of this is an inclusive sense of community. And I want to emphasize in particular, sorry, my neighbor's dog is barking, that I talk about inclusion because I think community is important. It's important to feel like you're part of a group and that your relationships matter to you. It's also important for you to feel like that group is actually constructed around your identity, and that you are not sort of a member of some, like you're not in somebody else's house, right? This is your house. And I think it's important for us all to be considering, I think it's always been important, but I think now it's been raised to greater consciousness, is what identities are our spaces constructed around? Are our spaces inherently, are the activities we're engaging in, are the people we're serving in our service organization, in our service projects, are they one particular kind of person? Is the language that we're using inclusive? Are our events accessible to those people who are differently physically abled? Because if we're not thinking about how we have the potential to be exclusive, then we're not thinking about the ways that people may become disengaged and not be retained because they don't feel part of something. So I think inclusion is really at the root of all of this. So that's the triangle, and I think that's easy. Programming, stability of your operations, and inclusive community. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. But if you do all three of these things, generally the reason that people won't be retained is because of external factors. If you have all of this stuff, then you'll be able to keep people around. Okay, let's crowdsource a little bit for like the next, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes on some of these ideas. So, you know, I'd like you to provide some ideas from your own chapters. So how are some ways that your chapters have achieved operational stability? So this is things like committees, elections, like how do you create that sense that like your operations make sense and that people have access to them? Anybody have any ideas from your own chapter about how you do that? This dog, man.
Engaging the advisors to help out with the transitions over time.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that advisors are, and some chapters, just not a very well tapped resource, and they can be a great source of stability because, you know, they've been around.
Well, speaking from the advisory standpoint.
Yeah, well, I mean, me too. Well, I used to be an advisor. Now I'm, you know, 2,000 miles away from any chapter of the country, but yeah, 100%. Anybody else?
Okay, so I said earlier, I'm the surgeon at arms in my chapter, and
yes, your job is the rules.
literally,
yeah,
there's like joke about me always bringing up the bylaws during chapter or during events, and so we just make sure that like the bylaws already state, they break down how committees are formed, who's on committees, the roles and responsibilities of these leadership positions, and how like our mandatory events run. So I think just like following those properly, and everyone having access to what like our operations are and understanding those. And of course there's always like, if something isn't working as well anymore, there's always like the opportunity to change and update and refresh the bylaws and like the operational rules of our org. And that's how I think that Alpha Eta does a pretty good job of achieving operational stability.
That's great. And I think that you just tapped into something that I know we all get frustrated by it, but we all wind up in it, where it's we've all heard it. Like, well, we've always done it this way. And sometimes that's important. It's important to know why you've always done it that way. I think that is a valuable question to be asking. But that's not stable. That's sort of like lodged somewhere else. If you understand why and you think that has value, that's one thing. But I think questioning that, understanding it, and then being open to the idea that you can change it also contributes to that stability 100%. Anybody else? Let's have somebody else toss out an idea for how we achieve this. I'm gonna shut my window, people.
One of the things that I like to do as parliamentarian is just maintain transparency and what's expected of certain procedures.
Sure.
And I'll do that by like throwing little like sessions over the course of the semester just to like reiterate what it is that's being expected of the members and like go over the election procedures and all of that kind of stuff.
I think that's great. I think the more that people are informed about, this sort of gets back to that skills and knowledge piece in pledging, right? I think that sometimes because we educated people during the pledge semester, during the pledge term about like, oh, this is how our operations work. Sometimes there's a temptation to not necessarily go over everything in depth again. But, if you pledge and you might go through a pledge lesson in like, October about what the elections are going to look like, and then you don't have elections formally until like April. Like you have to go back over that stuff. So I think regular updates contributes to operational stability because everybody's aware of what their responsibilities are and how the organization should be functioning. Totally. Okay, these are some great ideas. So yeah, everybody take those to heart if you're not doing that in your chapter, if you're not talking to people more regularly about how things work. Okay. How about inclusive community? How do we create that in our chapters? I would love to hear some ideas about this.
At my chapter, our leadership.
Which chapter are you at, Christina?
Alpha Iota at OSU.
Very nice.
Yeah, so our leadership team, they do like I forget what the specific chair's name is. It's a vice chair that's in charge of diversity and inclusion, I think.
Sure.
And they'll host like brothers leading brothers events, so like roundtables. So I went to one about the Jewish community. Yes, inclusion vice chair. Thanks, Kachi. And just having that safe space to talk about things and having brothers that are willing to share their experiences and their thoughts on things is very nice to have.
Sure. Yeah, I think sometimes raising identities fully into consciousness in a way that's productive, I think can be great, especially for people who, maybe that identity is sort of latent, like maybe it's not talked about, but it's important to them. And I think having folks engage with it and learn more about that, I think can have a lot of value, 100%. What else?
One of the things that I've tried to do is also being VP of service is trying to orient service projects for different communities.
Sure.
So like there's been a lot of obviously like racial issues in like current culture. And so it's just trying to orient different projects to help different communities and raise awareness for those. And what we also just did in our chapter is change all of the pronouns in our bylaws to being gender neutral.
Sure.
They used to be like he, she, and then we changed it to all they and updated our inclusion statement. So
that's great. Yeah, yeah, again, if you were in that workshop at the NCAA building, I went on a large diatribe about the marginalization, particularly when we're focused on trying to recruit more men, that we ultimately wind up setting up really negative dichotomies about, oh, well, we have a lot of women, so we need more men. And there's a lot of people who do not identify with either of those genders that gets lost in the middle of that conversation. So I appreciate your interest in including more people. Semantically, I think that we forget how important that is as well. Yeah, and I think, one thing that I want to encourage everyone to do when we're talking about inclusive senses of community is understanding that your fellowship program actually has the capacity to sort of like be expansive and include this stuff. But something I'll talk about right at the very end of this presentation is fellowship programs should be about how do we create a community that everybody feels involved in, where they feel seen, where they feel heard, where they feel valued. And I think oftentimes our fellowship programs descend into, oh, everybody's having fun and they're hanging out with each other, and that's sort of enough in terms of a fellowship program. And something that we're working on nationally is how do we challenge you all to develop an actual fellowship program, not a series of fellowship events that are strung together by virtue of calling them fellowship, that is actually about how do we identify areas of weakness in our community? How do we identify areas that are that we have the capacity and possibility for improvement, to make people feel more included, to help people feel more seen, to understand each other more, to develop those bonds of trust and care and affection and all of that sort of stuff. And how do we use programming in order to do that? This is what your student life office and residence life offices are doing all the time. And we really want to try and encourage all of you to be thinking about that. The membership vice president, in my mind, is all about thinking about the individual members and are they engaged and are they sticking around. The fellowship vice president's job should be what is the group as a whole? How is the group as a whole functioning, and how do we make that function better? How do we make people feel more like part of a group? So that doesn't really give you like any insight into how to do that. But I think if you have fellowship vice presidents or fellowship chairs, encouraging them to be thinking about that, and not, I think there's always a danger in sort of just segmenting diversity, equity, or inclusion off into its own space without acknowledging that's just an overarching guidepost by which we should be organizing a lot of the things that we do in our chapters, most especially, I think, the fellowship program. Okay, I'm done with my rant. And then how about programming, everybody? What do you do to make sure that your programming is engaging to your members? And how do you know that?
Okay, I'll go again.
I got you.
Hi.
Hi.
I probably will not hear my voice too much, but
no.
So we, of course, like the exec members always try to hype up events during chapter. Like, we'll do highlights of what's coming up this week. But even like events that I go to, there's always like conversation check-ins and things like that, just to, make sure that it's not just, okay, we're all on Zoom on a website, whatever, but it's like, we're still finding time to commune together and talk and like be like, okay, you know, did anything exciting happen today? And someone like is like, oh, I saw this crazy thing. You know, I feel like that definitely like helps to just keep everyone engaged into what they're doing, because with Zoom, especially when your camera's off, your mic's off, it's very just, you know, have something going on in the background and still not be, you know, involved in the event. But I think that we definitely try to have definitely chapter leaders, but even bros who might not hold like a leadership position, always like starting conversations and like, you know, keeping that going.
Yeah, I think 100%. I think understanding how you're engaging people in the event itself, it's not sufficient enough to just offer an event, right? It's about providing opportunities for people to actively be engaged in those things. And I think that's something really important for us to be thinking about, that you just sort of acknowledged there. I think sometimes the conversation sort of stops at like, oh, well, this is a great service project. So of course people are naturally going to be engaged. And it's like, but are they? Again, with the fellowship program thing that I mentioned earlier, I think that we've had this default of like, oh, if people hang out with each other, they'll become a community. That makes sense. Like it's just going to happen. I've heard many volunteers of the organization say that, like that's not that important. And I'm like, we literally have entire offices in our campus dedicated to forming communities between people. So I think that there's value to putting some emphasis on that. So yeah, Anina says giving member interest surveys. That I think is so important. You engage people by figuring out how they will be engaged. That sounds really rudimentary. Everybody hates surveys. I don't like doing surveys. A lot of people do not like this. It takes up time. But I think if you demonstrate that the surveys actually have value because you engage people in the way that they're asking to be engaged, then people won't hate the survey as much. They hate surveys because they feel like the data doesn't do anything, not because surveys suck. So if you do something with it and you make them see that, that's really valuable. Okay.
Breaking up into smaller group discussions rather than leaving it into large groups, because honestly, you get 20, 30 people together, it's hard to get things done. You get a group of 4 or 5, you can actually make actual decisions on things to the point where you can come back to the main group and say, here's what we discussed, this is what we came up with.
Yeah. Well, like,
and you mix the groups up every time, so it's not the same groups getting together every time. So it's, you do it this way one time, next way mix it up a different way, so it's different people talking.
Yeah, Sean, that's interesting. So one thing that I saw a chapter do one time that I thought was so cool is they in their chapter meetings, like every now and again, when they were sort of like running out of ideas in committees, they would just like do exactly what we're doing. They would like crowdsource an idea. So they put like small groups of people, like 4 or 5, and it was like, come up with an idea for a fellowship program or a fellowship event that we can do in the near future. And the groups would do it. They would talk about it, and then they would present their ideas. And then there would essentially be like a vote, and the top 3 were like, oh, we're going to do those things. And people who are in that group are going to organize that because people seem excited and engaged about it because we know that they're interested because we voted on it. And that's something I thought was really great, and it involved more people in the programming aspect than otherwise would usually be engaged. So there's an idea, folks. Okay, like I said, Brandon likes to talk and talk in third person. So we're gonna power through. So again, this is the retention model that I sort of mentioned: inclusive community, engaging programming, operational stability. There's another key aspect of this that I think sort of sits to the side of all of it and also above all of it, which is enthusiasm. If you can have all of these things and people can still be totally unenthusiastic about it. And I think enthusiasm is something hard to grasp. It's hard to figure out how do we make sure that manifests in a meaningful way, because it's emotional, right? It's not something that you like plan. It's not something that's operational in any way. But I think establishing a sense of enthusiasm, and sometimes it's about just being the biggest dork and just like forcing enthusiasm, like just being like, I'm gonna be annoyingly positive about stuff. Sometimes is what you have to do. I'm not saying to do that all the time. Sometimes people need to be serious. Sometimes seriousness is called for, and that actually contributes to an important feeling. But I think by and large, positivity enthusiasm about what you're doing, you know, championing and cheerleading the stuff that you're doing is really important. And I think that sometimes that gets lost in a conversation about retention as well. So don't forget that like feeling aspect of it. You want to feel good, right? You want to feel good about what you're doing and what you're a part of. So I'm not going to spend any time on this. We're not going to have a conversation, but again, think about how do we create a sense of enthusiasm. Some retention tips, just as we're coming up toward the tail end of this presentation, is number one, we've already said this, thank you. I think Nina said this, seek feedback and insight from your members. I think it's important to gather from more than just business. We need to be thinking about how do we engage the entirety of a person. People are brothers, or brothers are people and people are brothers. So tapping into the entirety of somebody's personhood, which is number 7 as well, is really important. And part of that's gathering for more than just hanging out on Zoom to do a meeting, right? Especially for membership vice presidents, but everybody in the chat, everybody's job is retention, right? So like recognize when people are disengaging and reach out to one another in a way that's intentional. I think that right now that's especially important. Like if you've noticed somebody disengaging, it's about reaching out to them actively, not just sort of allowing it to just pass you by. Engaging in values that you share with each other. Obviously, we talk about leadership, friendship, and service, but I think there's a lot of other things that bind us together that we don't acknowledge, right? We're driven by a sense of like trying to make the world a better place, and that I think a shared sense of like love and care for each other is the thing that will get us through stuff. And I think engaging in those values, talking about them, you know, again, these are the things that are latent. These are the things we don't talk about. But I think one way of building a community is by raising those values to consciousness and having people talk about them. Some of my favorite things have been when we like debriefed service projects and we would talk about like, you know, how did we feel about that, and talking about our own positionality, and talking about, you know, why certain service things matter to us. Like, I think sometimes it's like, oh, people in the chapter care about animals, and it's like, yeah, but why? And we don't necessarily engage in the conversation about why, but people want to talk about why. They're excited to talk about their dog that they had growing up. So engage people in that stuff. Recognize accomplishments. We have DSKs and all of this stuff. That's great. I love awards sometimes, but I think recognizing a bunch of other accomplishments is important, both within the chapter and outside of it. Like when I was on campus, one of my favorite things is anybody who participated in like a play from my chapter at Center, we always encourage everybody to go to the plays because they were free for students. And then we would like send a bunch of flowers to the person backstage. Like we'd all chip in to do that for each other. And it was just about recognizing each other and celebrating each other's personhood. And it's, like I said, it's great to recognize accomplishments within the chapter. You know, if people like took a really hard test and they passed it, like cheer those people on, right? Like acknowledge that, because I think the more that we value the whole person, the better off we're going to be. Again, like I said, allow room for solemnity and seriousness. I'm not saying that those things shouldn't exist. But I think overt negativity is always a mood killer, and I think is bad. I don't know how many of you, but I'm sure you have heard people, I've done it. And I'm just as guilty, right? Like in recruitment, we're like, yeah, we have a lot of problems, but that is bad. Don't do that. It's important to acknowledge that you're people, and like the chapter, you know, sometimes has stuff going on, but like raising that to like such a visceral level, I think you could talk about the issues that you're having, but I think like having a sense of hope about those issues, that we will make it through, that we can do something about it, that we have the capacity to make change, not like, oh, well, this sucks and it's always going to suck. That's not helpful. People won't be retained if that's what you're talking about. And like I said, have grace for each other. We all have a lot of shit. Look, I'm being recorded and I don't care. We have a lot of shit going on, all of us. And I think we need to acknowledge that sometimes people need to step away, and that's okay. And we need to re-engage those people. So one thing I mentioned earlier that I wanted to talk about, that we wanted the opportunity to talk about, is like, your chapter needs to be actively thinking right now about how are you going to re-engage people once you're back on campus that have fallen away because of this virtual format. And we've never really had to think, many of our chapters don't have a re-engagement program, but be thinking about that. That needs to be very intentional about how you reach out to people who may have stepped away at this point. So be thinking about that over the course of the summer, because that's a huge retention conversation that abuts recruitment. We have some retention resources, so you can go online, apo.org/resources/retention, tips, ideas, tools. There's a huge document about this that the membership committee produced, so please jump on there and check that out. I think a really helpful resource. But again, it's a really chapter by chapter specific thing. So thank you, everyone. We say mahalo nui loa. Thank you very much here in Hawaii. That is my email address, membership.chair@apo.org. I thought I listed my phone number on here. My phone number, in case you want it, I will freely give it out to people, is 808-304-3962. You are welcome to text or call, especially if you're back in the fall semester and you're driving really late at night and you're starting to fall asleep. I'm 6 hours behind you. I will keep you awake. And I'm always happy to engage in conversations about membership with all of you. There's some really exciting stuff coming up from the membership committee. I already mentioned the fellowship committee stuff. We're working on a new version of CAPS that's going to be coming out for next year. We have a pledge education or a pledge process evaluation document that we're going to be rolling out soon. There's a chapter operations card deck that we're coming out with soon that'll engage you with different ideas about how to stabilize your chapter operations and make them better. We have a rolling recruitment model coming out for some chapters about how do you modify your recruitment if your campus is becoming more and more uncomfortable with the idea of pledging. We really want to get ahead of the curve for campuses that are moving away entirely from a pledging model. So there's a lot of exciting stuff coming out, and we're really happy to, I'm always happy to talk about any of that stuff with you guys. So thank you. We have like 2 minutes, so there's not really an opportunity for questions, but you have my email and you have my phone number, so you can always reach out.
Thank you so much, Brandon. This was really fun and really, I learned so much and I'm really glad that I got to hear from other bros from different chapters too. Thank you so much for hosting.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. And I will hopefully see all of you later at the quote unquote banquet that we're having, quote unquote. Yeah, thank you, Adam. I appreciate the visual of the quote unquote. But yeah, I hope to be able to hang out with all of you a little bit later on. Christina, you're from the petitioning group. That's so exciting.
I am.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone. Take care. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
I'm gonna have some breakfast. Bye-bye.